On a cool summer evening, the local park in a small Midwestern town was alive with chatter and laughter. A group of teenagers, led by 16-year-old James Hudson, a bright and well-mannered black boy, had gathered under the glow of streetlights to share stories and enjoy the mild weather. James, known among his peers for his sharp intellect and quiet confidence, often acted as the glue of the group. That evening, his infectious smile and light-hearted jokes were the centerpiece of their small circle. As the hours passed, a sense of unease crept into the park. Across the street, Officer Bradley, a middle-aged white man with a reputation for being quick to judge and harsh in his methods, sat in his patrol car, watching the teenagers. For months, Bradley had been fostering a suspicion that the local youth, particularly those from the minority community, were responsible for petty crimes around the neighborhood. With his belief fueled more by bias than evidence, he decided to confront them. Bradley approached with a stern expression, his boots crunching on the gravel as he neared the group. The once lively chatter died down as the teenagers exchanged uncertain glances. "What are you kids up to at this hour?" Bradley barked, his tone laced with authority. James, maintaining his composure, stepped forward. "Just hanging out, sir. We're not causing any trouble," he replied, his voice steady yet respectful. James had been taught by his parents, particularly his father, a prominent figure in the military and government, to approach authority with dignity and restraint. Bradley's eyes narrowed. "At this hour? In this park? Looks to me like you're looking for trouble," he retorted, his voice rising. The officer's words dripped with insinuation, and his hand rested lightly on the baton hanging from his belt. The atmosphere grew tense. James's friends shuffled uncomfortably but remained silent, their faces betraying both fear and confusion. Sensing the situation spiraling, James responded firmly yet calmly. "Sir, I don't think we're breaking any laws by being here. We're just spending time together." Bradley, unaccustomed to such composure from someone he perceived as a troublemaker, saw this as defiance. "Hands on your head, kid. Now," he ordered, stepping closer. When James didn't immediately comply, Bradley grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around. "What are you doing? I haven't done anything wrong," James exclaimed, his voice rising but still controlled. His words fell on deaf ears as Bradley's temper flared. Fueled by frustration and a desire to assert his authority, the officer reached into his pocket, pulling out a lighter. Without thinking, he grabbed a lock of James's hair and ignited the flame. A sudden scream pierced the air as James staggered back, the acrid smell of burnt hair mixing with the night breeze. His friends froze in shock, their faces pale with disbelief. The once vibrant park was now a scene of horror and chaos. "Let that be a lesson to you," Bradley sneered, seemingly unfazed by his own actions. For a moment silence hung heavy, broken only by James's ragged breathing. One of his friends, snapping out of the shock, fumbled for his phone and began recording. Another bolted to find help. James stood motionless, the weight of humiliation pressing down on him. He clenched his fists, fighting back tears, determined not to give Bradley the satisfaction of seeing him break. Meanwhile, the officer, oblivious to the gravity of what he had just done, turned his back on the group, confident that his authority would shield him from any consequences. The aftermath of Officer Bradley's actions unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare. The smell of burnt hair still lingered in the air as James stood frozen, his mind racing to process what had just happened. His scalp throbbed from the searing heat, but it was the humiliation, more than the physical pain, that burned deeper. Around him, the world seemed to blur. The sound of his friends' frantic whispers, the distant hum of traffic, and the sharp crackle of Bradley's radio all faded into a muffled haze. "Turn off that phone," Bradley barked, snapping the silence. One of James's friends, Marcus, had instinctively started recording the encounter. His trembling hands gripped the phone tightly as he kept it aimed at the officer. "This is illegal. You can't do this to him," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and anger. His defiance momentarily drew Bradley's attention away from James. "I said turn it off." Bradley stepped toward Marcus, his hand hovering over his baton. Sensing danger, another friend, Tiana, stepped in, pulling Marcus back. "Let's go, Marcus, now," she urged, her voice trembling. She glanced at James, her eyes filled with worry, before grabbing Marcus by the arm and dragging him away from the scene. Bradley watched them retreat, satisfied that he had reasserted control. "Smart choice," he muttered, before turning his gaze back to James. "And you," he sneered, "you think you can talk back to me and walk away? Let this be a reminder to stay in your place." But what Bradley didn't realize was that the seeds of his downfall had already been planted. Marcus's video had captured everything: the flames, James's reaction, and Bradley's chilling words. The footage, shaky but clear enough to convey the gravity of the situation, was already being uploaded to social media by the time Marcus and Tiana reached a safe distance. As the video spread, the small town's typical quiet was shattered. Within hours, hashtags like #JusticeForJames and #PoliceAccountability began trending, amplifying the voices of those who had long felt silenced. Comments poured in, some expressing outrage, others disbelief. Local activists, long frustrated by the unchecked behavior of certain officers, seized the moment, rallying support for James and demanding immediate action. Meanwhile, at home, James's mother, Eleanor Hudson, stared at her phone in horror as the video reached her. She had always feared that something like this might happen, despite the respectability and power her family commanded. As the wife of General Marcus Hudson, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Eleanor was used to living under a public microscope, but this was personal. She immediately called her husband, who was attending a high-level meeting in Washington, D.C. "Marcus," her voice was urgent, trembling, "it's James. Something's happened." Marcus listened in stunned silence as she described the video. He could hear the tears in her voice, the restrained anger beneath her words. Without hesitation, Marcus ended the call and contacted his team. "Clear my schedule," he commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. "I need to be in town name immediately." Unaware of the storm brewing online and the powerful connections James's family had, Bradley returned to his patrol car, brushing off the incident as another routine lesson delivered to the town's youth. He wrote a brief and misleading report, framing James and his friends as suspicious individuals, and omitting the more damning details of his actions. Bradley had operated this way for years, confident that his badge and the unspoken support of his superiors would shield him from scrutiny. But Bradley's confidence was misplaced. By morning, his name and actions would be on the lips of people far beyond his small-town jurisdiction. Calls for his suspension and prosecution were already echoing across social media. James spent the night restless and quiet, the events replaying in his mind. His mother held him close, whispering words of comfort, while his father's voice, now on speakerphone, resonated with resolve. "Son, you've done nothing wrong," Marcus assured him. "This isn't over. I promise you, justice will be served." As dawn broke, James's world had already begun to change. Outside his house, reporters and camera crews gathered, eager for a statement from the family of the teenager whose story had captured the nation's attention. Inside, James sat at the kitchen table, his mother by his side, as they prepared for what was to come. Unbeknownst to Bradley, this wasn't just a case of misconduct. It was the beginning of a reckoning, not just for him, but for the entire system that had enabled him for so long. By dawn, the small town was anything but quiet. The video of Officer Bradley's actions had gone viral overnight, sparking outrage across the country. Local and national news outlets picked up the story, airing the footage alongside headlines like "Teen Burned by Officer's Abuse of Power" and "When Justice is Ignored." The phone at the local precinct rang incessantly, with reporters, activists, and concerned citizens demanding answers. Inside the Hudson household, the family was preparing for a pivotal moment. General Marcus Hudson, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, had arrived in the early hours of the morning. His presence, tall and commanding, filled the room with a sense of calm determination. Dressed in a sharp suit, Marcus exuded the authority of a man accustomed to resolving crises on a global scale. But today, this wasn't about politics or diplomacy. It was personal. James sat beside his father at the kitchen table, his hands clasped tightly together. Despite his composed exterior, his eyes betrayed the weight of what he had endured. His mother, Eleanor, stood close by, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, silently offering support. "This stops now," Marcus said firmly, his voice steady yet filled with restrained anger. "We'll address the press together. The world needs to see who you are, not just a victim, but a young man with integrity." That afternoon, a crowd gathered outside the town hall. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones and cameras pointed toward the podium where the Hudson family was about to speak. James, dressed simply but neatly, stood between his parents. His father took the microphone first. "I am General Marcus Hudson, Secretary of Defense," he began, his voice resonant. "But today I am here as a father whose son was subjected to an unconscionable act of abuse by someone who swore to protect and serve." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. "This is not just about my son. This is about every young person who has been treated unfairly, every family who has been forced to endure the pain of systemic failures. We demand accountability. We demand change." The crowd erupted into applause, chants of justice for James filling the air. Then James stepped forward. His voice, though quieter than his father's, carried a strength that silenced the crowd. "I didn't ask for this to happen," he began, his gaze steady. "But now that it has, I won't let it be ignored. What happened to me wasn't right, and it's not right when it happens to anyone. We all deserve respect, no matter who we are or where we come from." His words, heartfelt and genuine, resonated deeply. Within moments, clips from the conference were circulating online, further fueling the growing movement for accountability. Meanwhile, at the local precinct, Officer Bradley was beginning to feel the heat. That morning, he had arrived at work to find his name plastered across the news and social media. At first, he dismissed the outrage as overblown. But when his captain called him into the office, his confidence began to waver. "Bradley," the captain said, his tone grim, "we've got a problem. That video, it's bad, really bad." Bradley shrugged, trying to feign nonchalance. "It's being blown out of proportion. These kids were up to no good, and I handled it." The captain slammed a file onto the desk. "Handled it? You assaulted a teenager and it's all over the news. The Secretary of Defense is involved, for God's sake. You didn't just cross a line, you burned it." For the first time, Bradley's usual bravado faltered. "I didn't know who the kid was," he muttered defensively. "That's the point," the captain snapped. "It shouldn't matter who he is. You abused your power, and now the whole world is watching." The precinct announced an internal investigation, but the community wasn't satisfied. Protests erupted outside, with signs reading "End Abuse of Power" and "Justice for All." Bradley was placed on administrative leave, but the growing movement demanded harsher consequences. That evening, a televised panel featured activists, legal experts, and former law enforcement officers discussing the case. The consensus was clear. Bradley's actions were not only unethical, but criminal. Calls for his arrest grew louder as more details about his past surfaced, multiple complaints of misconduct that had been quietly dismissed by the precinct over the years. For James and his family, the outpouring of support was both comforting and overwhelming. Letters, emails, and social media messages flooded in from people across the country, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment and offering words of encouragement. Back in Washington, lawmakers began discussing broader implications. "This isn't just about one officer or one town," one senator stated during an interview. "This is about ensuring accountability at every level of law enforcement." By the end of the day, the Hudson family had become a symbol of resilience and the fight for justice. James, though still processing his trauma, felt a growing sense of purpose. His father's words echoed in his mind, "We'll make this right, not just for you, but for everyone who's been silenced." Unbeknownst to Bradley, the consequences of his actions were no longer confined to a small town. The system that had shielded him for years was beginning to crumble, and the world was watching. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind of activity. Protests outside the precinct grew in size, with people from neighboring towns and even distant cities joining the movement. Signs bearing slogans like "Accountability Now" and "No One is Above the Law" created a sea of voices demanding change. James's story had struck a chord across the nation, uniting communities in a call for justice and reform. Inside the Hudson household, the family worked tirelessly with their legal team. Marcus Hudson, leveraging his influence and connections, ensured that every detail of the case was meticulously documented. The goal was clear, not only to hold Officer Bradley accountable, but to address the larger systemic issues that allowed such behavior to persist. As the investigation progressed, the evidence against Bradley became overwhelming. The video of the incident was just the beginning. Testimonies from James and his friends painted a clear picture of the officer's abuse of power, and additional complaints from the community began to surface. These complaints, previously ignored, revealed a pattern of misconduct spanning years. Under mounting pressure, the district attorney announced formal charges against Bradley: assault, abuse of authority, and violation of civil rights. The announcement was met with widespread relief and applause, signaling the beginning of a long-overdue reckoning. During the preliminary hearing, Bradley appeared in court, his once confident demeanor replaced by visible unease. The courtroom was packed, with reporters, activists, and community members watching intently. James, seated between his parents, held his head high, his presence a quiet yet powerful reminder of the human cost of Bradley's actions. While the legal proceedings unfolded, the Hudson family channeled their energy into something greater. Together, they launched the Hudson Initiative for Justice, a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating abuse of power and advocating for reform in law enforcement. The initiative aimed to provide resources for victims, push for stricter oversight of police conduct, and promote community-led solutions to systemic issues. James, despite his initial reluctance to be in the spotlight, became a key figure in the movement. His poise and authenticity resonated with people of all ages. At rallies and forums, he shared his story, not to evoke sympathy but to inspire change. "I'm not just here for myself," he often said. "I'm here for everyone who didn't get a chance to speak up, for everyone who felt invisible. Together, we can make sure this doesn't happen again." After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the court reached a verdict. Bradley was found guilty on all counts. The judge's words during sentencing echoed the sentiments of a nation seeking accountability. "Your actions were not only a betrayal of your oath, but a stain on the trust between law enforcement and the community," the judge declared. "Justice demands that you face the consequences of your choices." Bradley was sentenced to several years in prison and barred from ever working in law enforcement again. The verdict was a watershed moment, celebrated as a victory for justice and accountability. Outside the courthouse, a crowd cheered as the Hudson family emerged, their expressions a mix of relief and quiet pride. In the weeks that followed, the Hudson family began to rebuild their lives. For James, the journey wasn't just about healing from the trauma, but about embracing a newfound purpose. He returned to school, where he was met with support from friends and teachers who admired his courage. At the same time, he continued to work with the Hudson Initiative, balancing his studies with his commitment to advocacy. The small town where the incident occurred also underwent significant changes. The police department implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation and bias awareness, and a civilian oversight board was established to monitor officer conduct. While these steps were only the beginning, they marked a shift toward greater accountability and trust. Months later, James stood on a stage at a national youth leadership conference, addressing an audience of thousands. His story had become a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up for what's right. "I learned that we all have a voice," he said, his tone firm yet hopeful. "And when we use that voice to fight for justice, change is possible. It's not easy, but it's worth it." The audience erupted into applause, a testament to the impact James had made. As he stepped off the stage, he felt a sense of closure, not because the fight was over, but because he knew he wasn't alone in it.